What's up, guys? In today's vid, I want to be talking about some sidechain techniques. We're going to be going over the way that I do my sidechains, and there's a couple of ways that we can look into doing them that are a little bit different. So let's jump into there and sort of like show you guys how, what's a couple of easy ways that we can get into this. My way is a little bit different from a few, I guess. Basically, the premise of it is to be able to send everything that you want sidechained into a group or into a send into something that's just combined everything into one, and then to sidechain it at the very end of that chain there. And then it goes into the master and then gets mastered however way that happens. So I'll show you guys how I do that. The idea for that is to have the sidechain at the very, very last kind of moment where nothing else kind of pulls it up. So basically what I'm aiming to eradicate is anything that's going to re-pulling up the quietness that we've actually tried to achieve with the sidechain initially. Whereas if you do it if you do sidechaining like earlier on in the piece, sometimes what happens is you get processing like anything that's like OTT, compression, saturation, anything that's pulling up a signal is going to re-amplify that sort of quietness that we've tried to achieve with the sidechaining. So the way that I sort of combat that is by sending everything that I want sidechained into a group or into like an in and turns into a track, and so we turn that into a group, and then I do any group processing there. So I might do a little bit of multi-band compression, a little bit of like clipping, saturated, and then I will have my sidechaining at the very end of that, which then goes into the master chain, which is only, again, it's just clipping and maybe like 1 or 2 dB worth of limiting, if I do the limiting at all. So there's nothing like pulling it back up necessarily. So what that does is it makes so much room for the kick to come through and the snare, and it just makes the kick and the snare, the clarity of those two elements, like so beautifully clear. And I guess a lot of people are kind of wondering how I go about making my mixes so clean, and that is 100% one of the ways that I do it. And apart from sort of sample selection and a bunch of other sort of variables that go into the sort of decision making when it comes to mixing and production, this sidechaining technique is one of the ways that I kind of achieve sort of such crispness, I suppose. So without further ado, I'll show you the way that I do it, and I'll show you another way that you can do some sidechaining with compression. This is going to be, I'll delve into some of the basics. The way that I do mine is through a volume shaper, and I'll show you that now. So as you can see in here, we've got all of my groupings that already happened. This is my template that pops up, and this makes sort of writing music like really, really simple for me, because I'm basically just, every time I open a project, all my groups are set up, and they all set up to go into my sidechaining already, so I don't have to like do any of that setup, because I do that every single time. If I was to open up a project, I'd be putting in the same sidechain technique every time, so there's no point in me doing that each time. I may as well set up the template. And I've been through this in sort of a little bit of a workflow video before, where, we want to try and eliminate anything that we do every single time that we open up a project, because what happens then is you start to eradicate and start to take away all of these little arbitrary tasks that take up time. So this is one of them. So I have a system where I have my break instruments, break drums, kick, snare, mains, extra, sub, effects, cymbals, drums, and vocals, and then I have a references section, which is a little separate. But all of these are going to be my main these are going to be going to my master. Now, the ones that I want sidechained will be things like the break instruments, the mains, maybe the extras, depending on how I want this to happen, the sub, maybe the effects, maybe the drums. So anything that I want sidechain, I'm going to be sending to mix B. Basically, I send everything to mix B because it gives me a overall grouping when it comes to my final sort of mix down, and I am able to process everything through this group. So I send everything there besides my cymbals and drums, and maybe my extras sometimes, because it gives me, like, apart from sidechaining, it gives me a little bit more sort of like grouping, gluing sort of thing. So I'll send mainly, I'm going to be sending these groups to mix A and mix B. And the way that I would do that, if I sort of redo all of this for you, I'm just going to leave these here actually so that I can go back to my own grouping. But basically, if I'm going to start off, we're going to be talking about grabbing 2 new tracks, right? Just normal tracks. We're going to open up 2 new tracks. Then what you want to make sure you do is we're going to set the both to in. And what that's going to allow us to do is actually route groups and tracks to these tracks themselves, because they are now like available for us to send inputs into or outputs into these tracks, and then they'll send them off to the master. So I am going to go ahead and type in mix A for one of them. And what this is going to be my kick and my snare. Those 2 elements I don't want sidechained. So I'm going to send them into mix A, and then nothing is going to be sidechaining them. And I'm going to have pretty much nothing on that channel because I want the kick and the snare to have as much transient information as possible. So I don't want to be clamping them or compressing or saturating them necessarily. So they'll be going to mix A. So as you can see here, I can open up my kick and my snare, and when you open up this little drop down tab, usually it goes to either external out or the master. This is usually what it's going to be looking like here. So what I want to do is then go down to find mix A. We've done 2 here. This is my normal mix A, so I'm going to send it to that. And right there, you can see that if I grab a kick, that is being sent to mix A down here. You can see the signal coming through, right? It's the same with this mix A here. I'll just show you for demonstration purposes. Mix A is the second one that we've done here. Should be going straight through there, right? So I'll do that with my snare as well. And what this does is it just means that it's going to group these 2 things and it's going to bypass the sidechain basically. So I'll make sure that this is going to the right. Weird. Hang on. There you go. So those are both going to mix A. That's just out of demonstration purposes. What we're really talking about here is mix B. So if we want to set that up, we're going to do the same thing with this, but what I'm going to do is actually group this, because the way that I do my sidechain is through MIDI triggering. So I'm going to make an audio track, which you already have, and I'm going to make an extra MIDI track underneath it. Now what this is going to do is it's going to act as the trigger track, and I'm going to be able to go in here and make triggers out of MIDI notes, which are going to trigger my volume shaper, which I'll show you in a minute. So now that we've grouped this is going to be called mix B, right? And what I'm going to do then is send everything that I want. And this is my main section, so all of my like basses and synths and stuff are going to be going there. So I'm going to send that to mix B. And now if I go in here and add in some, let's go and grab some LS Dream atmosphere stuff. If I grab that, solo this should be coming out of mix B here. Right? And so basically then I can just label this mix B with capitals, mix BB, there you go, just so we don't get too confused here, because when I collapse this down, I still want to see that this is mix B. So then what I want to do is actually you can do this on either the track itself or over the group. Doesn't really matter too much, but we're going to grab a volume shaper, or which is the way that I do it. Sorry, it's a shaper box these days. And we're going to go into the volume setting here. Basically, this is a volume shaper, right? So it's going to be triggering from our MIDI, whatever we decide this is going to be. So we can actually make a bunch of different shapes here. And this is pretty much just going to be ducking volumes like this, right? So the way that I set this up is by chucking it on, not compressor mode, sorry. We're going to go to MIDI trigger and do on one shot. And the bar, I usually do a quarter note. And then want to make sure that this is sitting on the edge there, because otherwise it ducks it strangely. I'm not entirely sure why it does that, but it is a bit weird. So we have that on mix B there. So what we then need to do is make sure that this MIDI channel here is actually triggering what's going on in this mix B channel here. And the way we do that is by going to the output here. So we can change the no output and we can make it go to mix B. And this is going to be the small lowercase mix B, because we have these two here, which are my initial ones, which we don't need to worry about right now. And then what we're going to do is you're going to see down here that this changes the shaper box. So if I was to do this again, we'd be able to choose two different shaper boxes, which I will do because I want to do a separate sidechain for my snare, but I'm not going to do that right now, just out of simplicity's sake. I'm going to leave it at just the one. And it should automatically just choose this shaper box for you. And basically what this is doing is it's routing its output to mix B so that it gets triggered by the MIDI that we are going to be putting in. So now, if we listen to this, that's doing its thing there, right? If I make a MIDI trigger, all I have to do is put it on any note, doesn't matter which one. You will notice now that this should have a bit of a side chaining pattern. Rock and roll. So we can see here that the sidechain is actually working by the little oscilloscope almost that comes up here, the little spectrum. So the cool thing about shaper box is that you can actually change the shape of it pretty customizable. It's super customizable basically, and it's really, really handy to be able to like really dial in what's going on. You can also do multi-band compression. So that basically just means you can come in here and start to like have two different shapes depending on what your spectrum desires. So for example, I will usually have this as my sub. You can see a spectrum here. If I pull a sub in, you'll be able to see where I want this to be sort of sitting. Go back to here, chuck in the shaper box. I'm going to set this to the right one. You can see that, you can really see that sub node right there, and that's the thing we want to be sidechaining for that, and this is going to be a separate one. Sometimes I want my highs to be a little bit sort of less affected, and so I'll maybe make this a little bit shorter, a little bit less severe, and then I might even make the mix sort of down to maybe 75 or 80%. And what that does is it gives a little bit less of a sort of effect, because sometimes it's a little bit too dramatic. Sometimes it's not, and sometimes you want dramatic, and that's totally fine. I used to do that a lot. Now I'm starting to have a little bit more of a sort of like fade that's not as noticeable. But when we were talking about the low end, I really, really want the sub to be completely out of the way of the kick, because I don't want two bits of sub information happening at the same time. And if I had the sub and the kick happening at the same time, that's where issues start to arise, and that's kind of what I want to avoid. So when I go into my sub, basically I want to completely get this out of the way of the sub and the kick there. So if I was to maybe get a kick, you can sort of start to hear the difference. One sort of interesting way to sort of check whether or not this is working. You can see here that's where my sub's sitting. And if I turn that off, you can see where the kick's hitting. And if I play these both at the same time, you can see what's happening here. So if I turned this off, if I turned these, deactivated these, you'll see that the kick and the sub start to erupt against each other, which is not exactly what we want. This is why we sidechain, so we don't have these sort of erratic volume amplitude spikes when the two sub bits of information like explode, because we don't want that hitting our limiter or clip or whatever we're using on the master, because that's what's going to cause distortion. So we want to get those two out of the way so that they can really shine depending on what the element is. We don't want anything else happening. The way we get our kick super loud is by having just the kick being the only thing that happens in the song at that point in time. And the same with the snare. We can really push things louder and clearer that way. So if we turn these back on, what we're going to do is we're going to start noticing that there's all this space. And I can see that there are still spikes happening basically. So if we have a look at the sub's not going to change in amplitude. That's it. That's where it should sit. And the kick is the same. The kick should hit the same every single time. Right, so that's where it's hitting. So if anything goes above this level here, this like sort of minus 4.53 level, we know that two bits of information are crossing over each other, and we want to figure out why and how to get rid of that. So I can see that it's still happening quite a lot. And so that means to me that I'm not getting rid of enough information down in this low end, and it means it's kind of clipping over each other. Oops, sorry. Just got all that. So hopefully now that I've opened up that sidechain just a little bit more, it means there's more sub being moved out of the way for the kick, and that the overlap is starting to really disappear. And that's what we want when we're doing sidechain. So you can sort of see that here. The other way to sort of check that is by grabbing an audio channel, just starting a new one, putting it to resampling, arming it, and then recording and seeing what the waveform looks like. So these look nice and clean. You can see that some of these are starting to cancel each other out. That's not too bad. This one's really nice. That one's not too bad. And that one's not too bad either. I'm not entirely sure why this happens, because we've really moved everything out of the way as much as we can, but you can see that that's like an issue. If we want to get really fiddly with it, that's how we can really start to notice what's going on. So the other thing that we can do is actually freeze this, put it to audio, and then we can actually start doing our own fades if we need to. So we can see that this one is a problematic area. So I'm going to redo this. So it's still a bit of an issue there, and I'm not entirely sure why. So this, we can maybe try and move this along and see what happens. So you can see what happens here. When you start to move things along, you can see that there's a bit of a phasing issue going on before. So this is what it used to look like, which is like a bit of phase cancellation, because there are two waveforms kind of overlapping each other and in a not nice way, and so they start to cancel each other out. So when we move this along, and the shortcut for that is Command Option and Shift, you'll start to get these happening a little bit nicer. So this means it's just going to be a stronger sub waveform. It's going to be a stronger sub, especially when you get into like bigger clubs and stuff, and bigger speaker systems. This is what's going to kind of like, this won't necessarily make a huge difference, but this is going to make it way more solid, I suppose. This is really fiddly shit, and not everyone's going to be doing this. Like, absolutely not everyone, but this is the kind of detail that you can go into when you start doing these side chaining techniques. So this is how you can go in and kind of make it. So basically what we've done is we've moved the actual waveform of the sub across, so that whatever potential phasing issues we had here are now kind of like eradicated and moved along, because you can see the difference where it starts to cancel each other out. It starts to flatten out, whereas this one looks nice and strong, this one looks okay, and this one looks okay as well. So those are some things that you can kind of look into. If I don't fade this anymore, I'm going to see whether or not this works out just as well. Right, so there you go. So there's some more phasing. If we maybe move this, that one's a bit nicer there. So there you go. We have a nice strong sub going on there that goes with the kick, and that's the kind of thing we're looking out for, because those are the sorts of things that we're trying to move out of the way when it comes to like side chaining. It's like a lot of the sub. referencing the sub sort of mixing here. This is some of the stuff we're looking into if we want to get that deep. So that's the way that I would sort of sidechain, that I do sidechain, and it's set up like that all the time. The other ways to sidechain involve using a compressor. I'll get more into this when I do a couple of mixing videos. I might delve deeper into why I do these things, but that's sort of a general idea of what's happening when I'm doing my sidechaining. The other sort of more basic way to dial in a sidechain is by doing similar sort of thing here. You can do this on groups instead, which is always, a more sort of straightforward way, because then you can kind of have a little bit more control, I guess, but this is definitely a way to do it. I'm making a new audio channel, so just a normal track. I'm going to rename it to SC1, right? I'm going to put this at the top of my project. This is going to make locating this really, really easy. So say I want to sidechain this mains. You can do this on Mix B as well. If you don't have a volume shaper, you can do this on here as well. Just the same exact way. So we might do that on the group just out of simplicity's sake. So what we're going to do is just grab, you can do this with any compressor. A really easy compressor to do it with is the Ableton compressor, and it does a really, really good job. Basically what we're going to do is going to drag it in. You're going to grab your kick, and we're going to make a ghost kick out of the audio kick, right? So we're going to copy that, and we're going to put this up here. And then what we want to do is we're going to turn this off, because we don't actually want the signal of the kick coming out of the master. We just want to use the signal of the kick to trigger the compressor itself. So we're going to grab this really quick and then send this to the compressor here. So we're going to open it up by moving this little arrow over, and we're going to notice that this says it's just a little sidechain button. We turn that on, it's going to say, where do you want to grab the audio from to trigger this sidechain? So we're going to click this open, and as you can see, we're going to make it nice and easy. There's SC1 sitting right at the top for us. So that's the reason why we put it there. Now, we are going to then start to map things, because I want to do this sidechaining and this compressor. I'm going to do this in serial with a few different things, with a couple more compressors compressing a little bit each time. The reason why I want to do that is because compressors work better when they're doing less a lot of the time. Not every single time. There are definitely compressors that work really well when they're getting absolutely slammed. In this case, it sort of you get a smoother result when you have a couple of compressors doing less of a job. So we're going to have a compressor doing sort of like 2 dB, 4 dB, 5 dB, and we're going to do that like 3 or 4 times. That's the idea anyway. So we are going to group this, and we are going to look at the macros here. So the things that we want to have control over are going to be the threshold. So we are going to go to this. I'm going to go to threshold. I'm going to map to macro 1. Want to do the ratio, map that to macro 2. Attack, we won't need. We're going to get the release and map to macro 3. Attack's going to be nice and short regardless, so we're going to leave that. Then that means I'm going to do a couple more of these, so I'm going to just duplicate these a couple of times. So because I've already mapped these, when I do the duplication, they are already mapped as well. So that's fine. Then you can go ahead and save this rack as just like your sidechain rack should you wish to do that. Now we have control over all of the thresholds, all the ratios, and all the release times. Now that's a really, really handy thing to have. So if we go in here and just play really quickly what's going on. I'm going to have to send this to my one, which I already got set up. Same with the sub. Right, so then we can go in here and pull the threshold down. So the ratio is just basically the intensity of the effect. The threshold is how much it's kind of pulling down. So the intensity and the amount are two different things. You will kind of understand that when you get to play with this. So I used to be like a 2-to-1 ratio, which is like pretty soft. Like every 1 dB is pulling down 2 dB. Whereas if I'm up to like 15 or 18, it's like for every 1 dB, it's pulling down 18 decibels. And so it's like more of an effect, if that makes sense. Have a play with that and get your ears used to what that means, because you'll sort of start to understand once you play with it. Right, so we've got that gone on there, which is great. We also have the release time. Now, one thing that we need to look at when it comes to release times is actually how much of a trigger we are using. So a lot of the time when you have a trigger, we don't actually want the entire kick to be the trigger. We want more control over the release times. So what we can do is actually make this trigger a lot shorter. So if we go in here and select all of them, the easiest way to do that I've found, selecting all of them and transposing them up as high as possible. So all you have is this little trigger right here. So if we go and have a look at the compressors here, you can see now that if we have the release time on the smallest amount, it's going to be a super, super quick release time. And that's really, really good because that gives us so much more control over what's happening here. So with dubstep, usually you wouldn't have it that quick. We're going to make this half time. So now you can see that I've got all control over the release times, and I can actually make this as tight or as loose as I want. That's a really, really good thing. I don't want this entire thing to be actually controlling the release time, because then I don't have as much control as I would like. So now this is kind of shortened and just gives us this. So that's the trigger, and then you can control how slow or long you want that release time to be. Now this is pretty much it when it comes to compressing and using that as a sidechain. From there, you can go and dial this in to the sort of groove of your track, and you can dial in. Usually it's going to be sort of, I think I usually like it around this kind of area, that's sort of 90 millisecond area when it's 150, but you can go in and really check, like we did before, what's happening in the actual waveforms, and you can see like whether or not it's taking enough out, or whether it's, you need to pull back even more, or let some more through, or like any of those sorts of things. You can then go and do multi-band versions of this as well, which I will get into in another video. This is just a sort of basic idea of what's happening in a sidechain. The other version is how I do my sidechain. I do this sidechain version in things when I want to have a more subtle effect, and I'll do that in, say, like breakdowns. And when I do it over the drums in like a breakdown section where there's just piano and like vocals and stuff like that, I'll use this instead of the intense sort of volume shaping. And I find this is a little bit quicker to sort of like dial in sometimes. But I hope that is helpful, guys. This you can also do as well, just to quickly roll over this. I can name this as a kick sidechain, and then if I wanted to, I could actually make another one. I can make this into SC2, and this can be, say, the snare, and I can use a similar trigger, and I can move that over. I can have a snare pop up here. Okay, that's obviously move that there we go. So I'm going to need to pull this out again. So then I've got this SC2, and basically what that means is I have control over whether or not I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to call this one snare, and then I'm going to go in here and select SC2 for all of these boys, and then that gives me control over how much the snare has effect over the sidechain as well. So I have another sidechain for the snare, and I have a sidechain for the kick, so they are independent of each other, and I can do separate settings for each one, and that's just another extra bit of control, which I find really, really helpful. And again, I don't want the entire, if I had this, I would have zero control if I had this whole sort of audio file triggering the sidechain, I would have no control over the release time. Necessarily want it taking the entire thing out. I kind of want it to be a little bit tighter than that, because there's information going on through the entire sample here, which is all just like noise, and I don't necessarily need a sidechain happening for that entire time. So what I'll do, come down here. What it sounds like when you do the like excessive amount. So the way that I would dial this in is actually by sort of like doing an excessive amount of effect, and then I would start to dial it back and try to find where like it sits really nicely in terms of groove and in terms of intensity. So you can hear that snare is like quite ridiculous. And so if I pull this back, same with the release time, that just doesn't make it back at all. It's the other thing I want to make sure actually is I want to be looking at peak here. I don't want to be doing RMS, I want peak. Sometimes it comes up as RMS default, but peak is kind of what you want to be doing here. That's kind of a nice intensity for the sidechain. On the snare, it's not too much. It's a nice length. These are all the things you want to be sort of listening for when you're dialing it in. Have a play with this and see where you get with it. But this is kind of how I do my sidechaining when it comes to compressing, which is kind of the more conventional way to do it. But I hope this video helps, guys. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next video.